In the world of international relations, one theory has stood the test of time: theory of realism. Often referred to as the most accurate and brutal, realism focuses on power, national interest, war, and conflict. We will explore the history and the theory that explains the harsh reality of international politics and why all superpowers are bad. Realism as a theory of international relations emerged during the mid-20th century with authors like E.H. Carr and Hans Morgenthau. Realism is sometimes associated with realpolitik due to their focus on power. However, they are entirely different. Realpolitik is a prescriptive guideline limited to policy-making and statesmanship that emerged in early modern Europe, while realism is a wider theoretical paradigm explaining international relations. Realism can be divided into two main branches: classical and neorealism, with further separation of offensive and defensive realists, together with the newest perspective of neoclassical realism. The theoretical framework of classical realism was formalized with Hans Morgenthau's influential book Politics Among Nations, while neorealism's framework was formalized with Kenneth Waltz's book Theory of International Politics. In this video, we will first start with classical realism. But to get a comprehensive explanation, let's first get back to ancient times, as realists often draw on ancient traditions of political thought. Classical authors often cited are Thucydides, Niccolò Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Max Weber. Realism's roots are found in humankind's earliest historical writings, particularly Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was fought between the two ancient superpowers of the Greek world, Athens and Sparta. In 416 BC, the island of Melos, which had ties with Sparta but was neutral in the war, faced the mighty Athenians, with the ongoing negotiations dramatized in the Melian dialogue. The Athenians offered the Melians an ultimatum to surrender and pay tribute to Athens or be destroyed. The Melians argued that they have the assistance of the gods because their position is morally just and that Sparta will come to their aid, in which the Athenians responded in a brutal way. Since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Fast forward to the Renaissance. Niccolò Machiavelli, an Italian diplomat and historian, wrote his political treatise The Prince, Il Principe, published in 1532, 5 years after his death. Often called the father of modern political philosophy and political science, Machiavelli shattered the moralistic view of authority from the previous writings in history that a good leader is and should be humble, moral, and honest. For Machiavelli, a successful ruler is brutal, calculating, and, when necessary, utterly immoral. Summing it up, it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot have both. In one of the earliest and most influential examples of social contract theory written during the English Civil War, in 1651, Thomas Hobbes published The Leviathan. Hobbes' thought experiment envisioned human existence in a state of nature without any community with anarchic order. Therefore, given human nature, desires, and limited resources, this state of nature must be a war of all against all. Concluding that this can only be avoided with a social contract and the rule of an absolutist monarch with a strong and undivided government. Now that we have reviewed some of the classical writing in history, let's move on to post-World War I. a time of both optimism and pessimism in international relations. The formation of the League of Nations and the first efforts of collective institutions to prevent future wars. E.H. Carr, a British political scientist and historian, was highly critical of this idealistic notion of progress and safety through international institutions such as the League of Nations. The outbreak of World War II converted many scholars to that pessimistic vision and paved the way for realism to be established in American political science departments. As mentioned in the beginning, Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations established a general theoretical framework for realism and became one of the most extensively used textbooks in the United States and Britain. Morgenthau sought to develop a comprehensive theory and drew heavily from the insights of historical texts and their focus on human nature. In his view, in a similar way to human nature, pursuing the national interest is not subject to calculations of morality and is therefore amoral. In his book, Morgenthau included a section in the opening chapter called 6 Principles of Political Realism. The first principle is that politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their root in human nature. The second principle is based on the concept of interest defined in terms of power, meaning that nations always define and act to secure their national interests by means of power. In the third principle, Morgenthau claims the concept of interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid. However, the scope of national interests, nature, and power are dynamic and not static categories. The fourth principle acknowledges the importance of moral principles, but holds that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract universal formulation. This means that states are not expected to uphold the same standards of morality, since the primary function of a state is to ensure its national interest by means of power. The fifth principle refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. Because foreign policy is based on national interest and not on morality, any identification of national policies as the true manifestations of moral principles is bound to be misleading. The sixth principle is that international politics is an autonomous discipline primarily governed by political standards focused on national interest and power. Morgenthau argued that skillful diplomacy drawing on these principles could lead to stability via the balance of power. He wrote that the balance of power and policies aiming at its preservation are not only inevitable, but an essential stabilizing factor in a society of sovereign nations.
You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
The Freedom Bell in West Berlin tolls in sympathy for East Germans on the first anniversary of the Wall of Shame that holds them prisoners.
Fast forward 2 decades, and realism's influence was outdated in the era of social scientific behaviorism from the 1960s, mainly because it drew from a wide variety of sources and was heavily focused on the human aspect of international relations. It was more united in its criticism of liberalism and institutionalists than its theoretical basis. Realism was revived during the 1970s with Kenneth Waltz's book, Theory of International Politics, marking the emergence of NeoRealism or structural realism. Waltz managed to take the key insights of classical realism and translate them into the modern language of social science. In this way, realism was reconfigured as a social scientific theory that can be empirically measured, in contrast to human nature and other traditional views that cannot, making them largely irrelevant. Waltz argued that the most important aspect of international relations is the anarchic structure of the international system. In short, every action can be explained and is defined by the structure. According to Waltz, Nation-states are unitary rational actors existing in a self-help system, one in which each state must fend for itself. The main goal above all is survival in a system where states operate with imperfect information. As previously stated, the main currency in this system is power, or more precisely, the distribution of power in the system. This competing self-help system pushes countries towards finding ways to increase their security and power. However, increasing one's security can decrease the security of the opposing power, leading to a security dilemma. Think of the Cold War nuclear arms race. Thus, security becomes a zero-sum game where only relative gains can be made. In a system plagued by potential security dilemmas, the balance of power, or polarity, can tell us much more about the system and its stability. Realists are focused on great powers since they are the biggest actors or units that can shape, influence, and change the structure of the system. According to the distribution of power, the system can be unipolar, one dominant superpower, bipolar, two superpowers, or multipolar, three or more superpowers. Waltz argued that the most stable arrangement was bipolarity, or a balance between two great powers. Neo-realists eventually split into defensive and offensive camps. Defensive realists, following Waltz, argued that states tend to seek security where stable international equilibrium is possible via balancing. Therefore, defensive realists view power as a means to attain stability and security. In contrast, offensive realists argue that states seek to maximize power rather than security, making equilibrium harder to achieve. According to this view, power is both a means and an end for stability and security. Waltz's work proved influential and dominated the field for much of the 1980s and 90s. And yet, the theory had seen its newest version, called NeoClassical Realism. You can immediately notice the double meaning of the term, first coined by Gideon Rose in 1998. NeoClassical Realism is a synthesis of NeoRealism and Classical Realism. The main motivation here is to explain NeoRealism's shortcomings about particular states' behavior in modern times by adding domestic intervening variables between systemic incentives and a state's foreign policy decision. Realism, as with any theory that tries to explain the world, is incomplete and has its limitations. Realism's critics argue that a realist's worldview can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The major critique is that it fails to take into account many modern topics like interdependence, globalization, transnational issues like terrorism, and supranational institutions. Furthermore, it holds a one-sided and simplistic view of human nature and its motivations. All these topics are addressed in other international relations theories like liberalism and constructivism, which you can watch on our channel. If you made it this far, then congratulations. Be sure to like and share the video with your friends if you think it is valuable, and let us know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to The Political Affairs to watch other videos as we explain key concepts, theories, and events from the world of politics and international relations.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hail the end of the war in Europe.
Realism has remained the most powerful research theory in the study of international relations in regards to conflict, competition, war, and power. So if you start seeing the world through realism lens, you will start to see great powers without the moral position of simply good versus bad nation states, but rather like unitary actors seeking to accomplish their national interests in a system without higher moral and power authority. Therefore, for a leader to rely on idealistic outcomes would be a terrible mistake and a great disservice to his state.